thank you for agreeing to be a part of this conversation. And before we get to know you, I'm going to kind of just take a step back in terms of this topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion in senior living. We had a previous conversation on this topic that was, right after some of the violent incidents that occurred in the Midwest, and what the catalyst for that first conversation was a home care agency that had a lot of African American employees, and they were sort of like, we're trying to do something and listen to our employees on this topic, and let's bring together the community, because if we're having this in our company, we're all having it in all of our companies. And it really proved to be a very engaging dialogue. And I expected that this would be something that we would revisit, whether it be monthly or quarterly or what have you. The catalyst for bringing our panel together today was just in my travels, I learned that Capital Caring Health created this Center for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity, and Broadmead, a life plan community up in the Baltimore area, was also doing some creative things. And I was like, man, this is a perfect way for us to showcase what some other providers are doing in this space. But then both of these organizations have brought on some great leaders to lead them through this. So I figure you guys are an excellent panel to help us with this discussion. So welcome. That's my rambling introduction there. So how about what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around the little cube here and get to know each of you a little bit better, and what and your organizations a little bit better, and then we can open this up to a dialogue with the audience and with you guys sharing your thoughts on this topic as well. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely.
Excellent. So, well, let's start with to my left, we've got Jennifer, Dr. Jennifer Marana. She's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Broadmead. Welcome, Jennifer, and tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about Broadmead, and a little bit about what your organization is doing related to diversity and inclusion.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. Steve, thank you for organizing this and, having me be part of it. So once again, Jennifer Marana. I started at Broadmead just over a year ago when they created the brand new position of Director of Diversity and Inclusion. But prior to that, I had done diversity work in higher education and in healthcare. And so senior living has been a whole new industry and experience for me in just the past year and a half. But in terms of some of the work, in higher education and healthcare, there's a lot of similarities. It's just the population that's different, and the opportunity to learn more about how to best serve the populations that we're working with and the communities that we're working with. In terms of my personal diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, I actually started this work started doing diversity related work in the late 90s. I had gone through a training and my first ever diversity training in higher education at the college that I was working at. And it was so eye-opening for me because it was the first time that we, through the training process at work, that we were asked to share our stories, share our experiences, learn about each other really deeply behind all of what we were presenting for work. And it was really eye-opening for me because I got to talk about being a first-generation college student. Just aspects of my identity that I didn't really talk about in other spaces. And so it felt very empowering, and it was a great way to connect with my new colleagues. And so that was, when I think about that early experience with diversity training, it made me want to do that kind of work and create those kind of inclusive, empowering spaces for other folks, not just in their workplace, but wherever I could. So that was kind of the beginning of my diversity journey. Higher education, healthcare, and what attracted me to Broadmead was the very fact that they were willing to embark on this journey in senior living that was really, the conversations were not as prevalent as, say, in higher education. And Broadmead, being a Quaker-based organization, it's 40 years old, there was always this sense of commitment to social justice, a commitment to, to people of color, to movements, etc. But what they weren't seeing was they weren't seeing the visible change in the population of residents. It was still a predominantly white population, and then a predominantly, in terms of the staff, predominantly people of color. And so once again, they were doing the work, they had committees, they were doing outreach, they were having conversations, but they decided that they really needed to take this to the next level in terms of having somebody come in and really move the process forward, somebody who had some experience doing it, even in other industries. So that's kind of some background on Broadmead and how and why they created this position. There is the strong recognition that the older adult population is growing larger and more diverse. We know this. And Broadmead's just said, you know what, why don't we be the ones that can create that inclusive community, that have it, and that we just need to make sure that communities of color know that, and that we are going to be a welcoming space. So what we've been doing, outreach, although since COVID, it's been more challenging because the outreach has been more around trying to connect online and virtually. But really, it's been the conversations within the community that have been most impactful. I liken our Life Plan community to a college campus for older adults because there's such this stimulation and desire to learn and engage. And so one of Quakers practice a moment of silence. We do it before meetings. That's part of their kind of a practice that Quakers do. So we started incorporating a moment of silence every Friday at 1 o'clock. And some of the residents in clusters, we give them a query, a question, something to ponder mostly around racial justice and kind of their own identities and lived experiences. And so every Friday at 1 o'clock, some of the clusters, they get together in person, the residents, socially distanced with their masks on, and talk about the query. Some of them join me on Zoom. So I'm just giving this an example of some of the conversations that are being done. And then on the staff level, making sure that voices are heard. We created a executive advisory committee of frontline staff members who sit in our executive leadership team meetings, so we hear their voices and that their experiences and input are part of our senior leadership conversations. We have a diversity recruitment plan. This spans all levels across staff, residents, and board members. And so training, the stuff that we have to kind of do together and as a community to move our whole organization forward. I'm happy to get into more detail, but I want to make sure that I take a step back and we get to hear from the other panelists.
Absolutely, great overview, and hats off to Broadmead, which is a life plan community combining independent, assisted, and nursing all on one campus, to bringing you on board and addressing this in such a broad and holistic way. So that was a great overview. And so now let's move down to the bottom of the screen and meet our team members from Capital Caring Health, which is again another super innovative organization. I'm just blown away at some of the things that you guys have been doing, and really excited to hear about to meet both of you and then hear about the vision for the Center for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity. So we've got, let's see, to my left and your right, Keith Everett, who is the Chief Officer for Performance, Compliance, and Cultural Operations at Capital Caring Health, and Antonio Garrett, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Inclusion, Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity. So Keith, since you're right there below Jennifer, I'll start with you.
All right.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. And I echo actually, Jennifer, really happy to be here. Happy that you really put this panel together. I think it's a really important discussion, especially in our space. I think other healthcare entities in the acute care space have really tackled this and probably have been tackling this for the better part of 10 to 15 years. And the question is do you get traction on it? And within our space, we don't get it as much, right? And so I think for us, we're moving within that direction to actually get there. And a lot of the work, Jennifer, that you and Brian Mead have done has been fantastic. For me, as you said, I'm the Chief Officer of Performance, Culture Operations, and Compliance. That's a really long title to just say that I do a ton for the organization. And it's really, I like to pick on Tanya and say that it's whatever she asks me to do, I do. The history about Capital Caring is a 40-year organization. Primarily started off as a hospice organization, and over the last couple of years have really transitioned to focus on advanced care illness and primary care, along with stay-at-home services, which allows patients to actually age in place, which I think is really important. We took on, Eltanya and I really took this on, I would say a little bit over a year ago, before all of the incidents that recently happened, to really start taking a look at hospice in general, post-acute care, or in a hospice space, or even at a assisted living facilities and things, doesn't have as much diversity. Is actually, there are studies and data that supports that over 60 to 70% of white Americans actually use these services, especially if they're covered by Medicare and Medicaid. And then those other protected classes are not. So African Americans, Asian Americans, those with different races and different backgrounds are not actually using these services. And we were always stuck with that question of why, like, why is that? And you think about the education and the training and the religious backgrounds and things like that to really help move us forward in meeting that organizational and community need. And so we stood up the center. And I'm only going to touch on it a little bit because I don't want to steal all the additional thunder from Eltanya. We kind of run the center together. So I want her to make sure that she adds in some input as well. But our center is actually something that's been a long time coming. We really decided, Eltanya and I really put a lot of work into developing our framework of the center that really focuses on, I would say, 3 primary areas, right? We want to develop integrative approaches to the communities we serve. So you think about those programs for African Americans, for Jewish Americans, for Asian Americans, in the Hispanic population as well. So we want to develop programs for that. We also want to have an internal based focus where we first look at ourselves. What are the things that we need to do within our own people, right? In our own workforce. So you think about the work that we need to do from a recruitment standpoint. Jennifer, I think that is excellent work if you guys have a diversity recruitment plan, and we'll probably talk to you actually after this to really get a copy of that, because I think those are ways that we can continue to move forward and from our internal based approaches. And then I hit a little bit on talking about our external based programs in the sense of what does our diverse community really need? We operate in Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And so in that, you know, you think about that 95 north and south, that sort of beltway, the diversity just in that area alone. How do we meet those community needs, and how do we adjust our services and our care to meet those needs? We are governed by the conditions of participation. So there's not, from a policy and regulation standpoint, there are certain things we must meet. However, how can we go beyond that? You know, in any policy, you can go above that, but you can't go below that. And so that's what we're really looking to do with the center and concentrating on our internal and external efforts. And I actually pass it off to Tanya a little bit to share a little bit about herself and the other work that we're doing with the center.
Great. Really great thoughts and an overview there. So the ball has been passed to Eltanya on this. Eltanya, tell us a little bit about yourself and you know, more information on what's going on at Capital Caring Health.
Right. And I continue to echo everyone's sentiments, Keith and Jennifer, and thanking you for putting this together today and inviting us to be a part of it. But I am Altanya Garrett, and actually with Capital Caring, like Keith, we do many things, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs and Strategic Partnerships and the Executive Director of the Center for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity. So just bringing that all together. But Keith gave you a good overview about who we are as an organization and things we've done. And he shared some statistics with you all, and they're really moving. When you break down the statistics, it's 82.5% utilization amongst Caucasian white Americans in hospice utilization. And then the next highest utilization group is African Americans, and that's at 8.2%. So that gives you a visual kind of the big disparity, the big gap there, and we're not meeting people where they are and helping them understand and utilize the services, and back at us understanding what we need to do different to rebuild trust in that community with, you know, the long history of mistrust and such. So we have a lot of work cut out for us in terms of a patient population perspective, from a racial diversity perspective, as well as gender diversity. You know, we're working towards LGBTQ plus initiatives as well, and others, religious and so on and so forth. We also, kind of like Jennifer, with our center, we do have it supported, I guess, by our steering committee with various department leads. And then we have ambassadors who are like our frontline staff, like Jennifer that brought me. They're our frontline staff who help bring a perspective to what we're trying to do and then help carry that message out to our other workforce. So we're doing a lot here. And just to kind of go back and give you a recap of some of the things we've done in response to the social unjust since the murder of George Floyd and others. But we did pull our staff together and did a listening session, a town hall type of remembrance gathering to allow our staff to be heard, to hear from them, to hear their fears, their concerns, et cetera, and to help give us ideas on how to best support them when things like that happen or continues to happen, and how we can make a change there. We have become accredited through the National Institute of Jewish Hospice to help better understand the history, culture, traditions of our Jewish patient population. And we become a stigma-free organization with NAMI, again, looking at mental illness and supporting our colleagues that live with mental illness. So those are some of the things that we have done, and there's, again, a lot more to do. And we look forward to working with Jennifer and our colleagues out there that are doing the same work to really make an influence and a dent here in the health community. So that's—
And now, Tanya, if I can sort of slight piggyback on that, Steve, I think the piece that Tanya and I have talked about a lot is that our success in this program is really based on 7 key things that we've actually developed in our framework. So education and training, that's not only to ourselves, internally to the organization, but also externally to the community. Leadership and governance. So, you know, our board, what is our executive leadership team doing? How do we continue to push this message forward? Responsibility and accountability, that actually lays on all employees and ourselves, but then also within the community. You know, what type of responsibility and accountability can we put on the community to make sure that they can research these services and things that are available to them? Our workforce is by far the most important thing. So you can tie inside a workforce also our volunteers, which are very, very important for us to do this great work. You think about our frontline staff, or those who are answering the phones, or those who are going out taking care of patients. They also need to be educated as well and be aware of all of these initiatives that we're doing, so that our patients and our families feel, you know, at home. Our policies and procedures, we recognize, again, internally, there are some modifications that we need to make within ourselves so then that we can be better for the community. And then one of the last is programs, again, back into program development. How do we work with colleagues like Jennifer and others in the community to develop these comprehensive-based programs to make sure that there's coverage for all of our community members, regardless of their race or sexual orientation or anything of that nature. And then finally, for us, it's measurement, right? Altanya put out some very shocking statistics there, right? How do we start to measure the work that we're doing to know that we're actually making a dent in this issue? And that's really what's big for us. And that's how we really shape the work that we plan on doing in this area to help sort of move that needle.
Man, Really impressive, all three of you and both organizations, what you're doing. And one of the things that I want to say to the audience is one of the reasons we're spotlighting these three individuals and these two organizations is they've made, as you can hear, this major commitment to an inclusive organization and workplace. And for some of you in the audience, it might be, holy cow, this is too intimidating. We can't do all this stuff. You know, really, it's designed, this discussion today is designed to be an inspiration for all of us to begin having conversations with our team members, our clients, and you know, making the world a better place for everybody. And so, but as all three of you have illustrated, this is one of these things where you do have to be careful. You can't have a conversation in a boardroom on one side of the organization and not be delivering the appropriate services and culture on the other side. So, so thanks for sharing these ideas. So I want to jump in, but back in and get some additional thoughts from all three of you. But before I do that, I want to remind the audience of the important role that they play on this dialogue. Jump in, guys. Raise your hand if you've got any questions, comments, ideas. You can raise your hand. Type in your questions and comments into Q&A, and I'm gonna kick this off because Elizabeth Robinson was quick to it. Elizabeth Robinson says, "What advice do you have for a DEI committee comprised of residents and staff to address issues for both and not just focus on one or the other?" Great question, and I'd love to hear our panel members sort of share that. And then I also see that Cordell, awesome. I'm glad you're on this discussion. Cordell's raised his hand, so I'll throw this this question from Elizabeth to you first, and then we'll get Cordell on to hear his question and comment.
Do y'all mind if I start?
No, please, go ahead.
So what comes to mind? So at Broadmead, there was a diversity and inclusion work group. There is that had actually begun. It was already going before I came to work there, and it was like you described, comprised of residents as well as staff and trustees, board members as well. And the work, you know, they worked collaboratively, but they made sure that their work was broad, and so it really is about intentionality. If you know that what we want to do is address this issue broadly as a whole community for staff as well as residents, so you set that intention and you create whatever structures need to be made. And so most recently we did create subcommittees, one for residents and one for staff, so that when we came together as a large group, we would have the larger conversation, but in between our quarterly meetings, there was other work happening. And the residents, you know, they're going to be able to speak to the needs of their fellow residents, and the staff knew this is what we need, this is what we're hearing as well, so that we're moving on both sides, you know, in both areas at the same time, and then coming together to collaborate and figure out where's their overlap, where we can partner and do some of this work together. So that's just some initial thoughts about how we, you know, how to move it forward.
Great. Any thoughts that that Keith and Antonio want to share?
I do got a couple of thoughts. Definitely agree with what Jennifer said. I wrote down a couple of things, and I think primary, what is your organization's goal of this, right? So you have this committee that's put together between staff and between residents, but what's the ultimate goal? Do you have buy-in from your leadership, from your governing board? I think you got to start there first. Second, then, you know, again, setting the intention, I think, is really important. But what are the needs actually? So how can you determine what needs need to be accomplished? And then what type of structure do you have within that meeting? Again, if you go in, and we've seen this a lot, that you go into a meeting, especially sometimes when it's a combination of residents and staff, there's just a lot of talking, but not a lot of action. So I think creating a structure that gives you the ability to allow individuals to, obviously vent and share some of their frustrations, but also create action. One of the things Eltanya and I just did, even with our committee, is that we've set aside, we have a 90-minute meeting every other week, and the first 30 to 45 minutes of that meeting is dedicated surely to just education for that committee group, so then that we can push that out. So think about that for your group. What type of education are you providing? That leadership and governance, the structure of the meeting, and then ultimately, what's the goal of that group?
Awesome suggestions. Altonia, you want to add anything?
No, I agree. I think intention and goal setting are key.
Great. Well, let me bring Cordell Martin. Cordell Martin Cordell was on our first panel member on this topic. He works at an assisted living community tribute at Melford. And Cordell, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. It was a pleasure to see that there was a second group that was going to be coming up. So I wanted to participate as much as I can. And greetings to all the panelists. And Steve, thanks for putting this on. My question to you, and it's not necessarily a question, it's more of a statement, and you can respond to it as you see fit. It's not surprising, I don't think, in this country, since with the statistics that Ms. Garrett was able to put up, showing 82.5% of hospice patients are Caucasians, whereas African Americans and Hispanics and Asians make up the other percentages and smaller. Because when we think about the income disparity, the ability to be able to afford the services that hospice would require. So I think we have two challenges, but for the purposes of today's conversation, are any of the groups that you all are affiliated with working on what they can do from a leadership standpoint? Because I often find, and I'll use the NFL as an example, they talk about the fact that we don't have coaches of color and that we don't have coaches of color that make up the ownership group. They're always in the worker role. What things do you see occurring within your own companies that suggest that they really are looking to expand the leadership role? I'm talking about those people that sit in the boardroom that make the decisions, because we have found historically, if you are in the decision-making room, then you can affect potentially the decisions that are made. But if you're not, then you get whatever they come out with. So that's my question or statement.
Great, great comments as all. Great to hear from you, Cordell. Yeah, would you guys like to share your thoughts on, Cordell's topic of leadership and diversity in the boardroom?
Yeah,
So, yeah, go ahead, Eltanya. No, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll start with that, and just at the front of his comment, he talked about the cost of hospice, and I just wanted to clear that up really quickly and then go into the follow-up. But the cost of hospice is one of the only maybe entitlements that people are given through their Medicare benefit if they have it, and that covers services at 100%. So there's no out of cost spending for the patients and families to get the care. And then many, of course, nonprofit hospices provide care regardless of any payer, and many of the for-profit ones as well. So there, in terms of cost, there's not a barrier there. So I'll address more later. I see questions in the chat about that. But to Cordell's point, definitely part of our framework, we talked about workforce development, and he's right. And I know in hospice specifically, leadership development is really key, because you don't see in the larger industry, over the 4,000 hospice programs out there, there is very limited leadership, CEO level, that is diverse. So it's definitely an area that we're working on at Capital Caring, looking at our workforce development, looking at leadership development, as well as ensuring our board looks like the patient population that we serve. And I know Keith wants to add to that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Eltanya. And I got to tell you, we actually have a very, I'll take that back, take very back. We have a diverse board. We have 2 women that's on our board, 1 of Hispanic descent. We have 2 African-American men that's on our board. But then also within our governance board structure, we have all of our subcommittees. So we have the quality, we have the finance, and those committees are also very diverse, I would say. So I think for our organization, Our governance has always been at a position, at least since I've been in the organization the last 5.5 years, there's been a lot of diversity within our boards. And I think recently, as we moved and we transitioned to the center, one of the things Altanya and I are doing is orienting the board again to the center and what we're doing and what it means, because it does start in the boardroom, to your point. It starts there, it goes within leadership, but then it's really, how do we ingrain this in our culture? You know, Altanya and I have spent plenty of time with our CEO to really highlight that this is not a fly-by-night program. We just want to do it. That's going to phase out in the next month. This is not. This is becoming something that's well integrated within our organization, that's becoming part of the moral fabric for the next 40 years. And that's our biggest piece of why we put so much work in developing our framework and developing those things that we want to measure, because that is going to give us that transitional success that we're looking for. And that's how we affect change within the community, by really starting internal with us. So that was a great point. That's a great question. Thank you.
Great. Jennifer, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so definitely, Cordell, you're right. Cost is a factor to consider. I would say, in addition, is part of it is also a cultural shift for people of color. And I'll speak for myself as a Filipino American whose parents told me early on, you're not sending us to those places, right? Those places being whatever, assisted living, skilled nursing, but not really knowing what Life Plan Community offers and what it is. And so part of it is kind of putting the education and the information out there about the existence of places like Life Plan Communities, because yes, cost is an issue, but let's say cost isn't an issue. We have people of color who could afford it, but who may not choose to go there, right? And so I think that's another some work that we're also doing at Broadmead to kind of shift some of that framework. In regards to leadership, you're right. I mean, if we were to hold the mirror to ourselves at Broadmead, we have work to do, and that's why we have the diversity recruitment plan, because we know that our board could be more diverse. We know that our leadership could be more diverse. And so what I mentioned earlier, this executive advisory committee, that has allowed us to really have voices at the senior leadership table and make sure that while we don't have any open positions currently, there's still an opportunity and the value of making sure other voices are heard, that it's not this predominantly white group of leaders just sitting at a table making decisions on behalf of the whole organization without other voices being taken into account and without their voices being heard. So that's what we're doing in the meantime as we're working out our diversity recruitment plan. And then, like Altonia and Keith said, also leadership development. We have some amazing folks within our organization who just need whatever kind of support to move up. And so we're working on integrating that and creating spaces and opportunities for that leadership development in-house. Another thing, and Keith, you referred to this, this infusion, this integration of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization overall. And I want to emphasize that point, because it's not just, oh, yay, check off the box, we hired a person of color as, the CEO or in a certain leadership position. It's ongoing, it's a journey, and it impacts all aspects of our work. And so to integrate it into just our everyday, so that Keith and Altonia aren't the only ones responsible, I'm not the only one responsible at our organizations, everybody is, accountable to it. Everybody is taking part. Everybody is playing a role in all of this.
I think what Jennifer is saying, a part of that, Jennifer, I'm picking up on is the cultivation, right? So like if you think about for us, not only within our leadership cultivation, but also for our board. So depending on your type of board, your board leadership may change every 3 to 4 years. However, your subcommittee board may change actually every year. And so with that, I think is really important that in those subcommittee boards that you do have that recruitment plan in place, because those actually end up becoming your future board members, right? You really want to cultivate those individuals because now they've spent time within the organization, they're a future board member or potentially a leader. You never know what type of volunteer you have on your board that actually may end up becoming an employee, right? So that's part of that cultivation. So I appreciate you saying that.
Great. And we got a bunch of questions that are coming in, that I want to address, and I see Ken Silverstein has his hand raised, so I'll get to you, Ken. Let me read a few of these questions. I like this one from Paula Phillips because it's a little bit in a different category than we've had from both of these discussions. It's Paula Phillips says, I'm a resident counselor of a senior apartment building that is multicultural. Many of our residents do not speak English, but there are some who have a fair amount of comprehension. I'm at a loss as how to get the residents together just to have fun with each other across cultural lines. Really good challenge. I would put that as for the group. And I urge the audience to jump in on chat if you've got ideas. But I'm curious to hear the panel's thoughts on when, bringing the residents or the members together that are diverse and finding common ways that they can build community.
I'll jump in on this one first. I think this is going to sound really, really simple. I'll give you that caveat, but it's not as simple as it sounds. But understanding and finding the cultural norms, right? So every culture, regardless, where you are, have some level of norms. So for instance, if I was to say that African Americans really like playing spades, right? That's a card game. So are there other cultures that really appreciate playing card games, right? So you need to determine what some of those cultural norms are, where they sort of cross-pollinate. And that gives you the opportunity to bring those residents together in that space. We've seen sometimes in like nursing homes or older adults love playing bingo. Doesn't matter their culture, they just love playing bingo. So that to me seems like that is a cultural norm that sort of integrates around all cultures. So is there things like that that you can not only identify, but then implement those things within your residence or within your facility?
Great. Yeah, I mean, games and yeah, different cultures play different card games, but they're all card games, and you could see where there could be sort of a fun experience in teaching a different group how to play our game, and we're going to learn how to play your game, and now we're all playing each other's games. Great idea there, Keith. This is a similar sort of challenge that I want to throw out there from Allison McMichael. I work within senior centers through Baltimore County. My specific senior center is mostly Caucasians with some minorities. What are some ways to help us increase the minority population of our senior center? Also, what ways are there to start the conversation with resident members about equality, inclusion, and diversity? I want to, I know I'm not a panel member, but I love sharing this story because it relates to this, is that many years ago, there was a gentleman, and I wish I remember the name of the adult day center, but he had strong ties to the Persian community in a church. And when he opened his adult day center, he filled up 50% of the tables with the Persian older adults in the program. But then what happened was when they would start to bring in new participants who weren't Persian to the adult day center, that it seemed rather intimidating because people looked into the room and said, geez, I'm not like, they viewed themselves not from a different cultural background and didn't feel that it would be intimidating to sort of get into those conversations. And they tried a bunch of things, but then what the success was, he identified a leader in the Hispanic community. And what she figured out was, I'm not going to bring one person into this center. I'm shooting to get a whole table at once. And so a table was 6 people. And so she went out there and recruited and found 6 Latino Hispanic older adults who were interested in the adult day center. And she got them together at a table. And when they had their friends at the table, they were able to engage with the other tables much better. And so their sort of model for sort of breaking the cultural boundaries was not getting one person, because that's very intimidating, but getting a group of people to come in where they can interact as a cultural group. But I'm going to shut up and let the panel talk, but I did want to share that one anecdote.
And I would just add, you know, that was outreach, right? They had to go out and find those folks. And so part of it, I know that it's challenging right now amidst COVID and I know for me, outreach has definitely been more challenging, but prior to COVID, I was doing what I could to be visible in the community, to build those relationships. And it wasn't, to be honest, and Broadmead is aware of this, this isn't an overnight, you know, we're not going to see the changes overnight in our community, but what we're trying to do is build the relationships in the community over time, so that Broadmead becomes a household name, and then it becomes a synonymous with trust and great service and connection. So even if they could just come for a program, even if they come to just stop by for you know, and not to live here, that's okay. It's important for us to be visible in the community and start building those relationships.
No, that's great. Let me bring Ken Silverstein on. Ken's had his hand up there. I wanted to get to a few of the questions that are coming in via.
Hey, Steve, while you're pulling him up,
Yep.
can I ask for follow up with that, but then also answer Nicole's question that's in the Q&A box about the 2 or 3 things, most effective ways?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so to piggyback actually on what you and Jennifer were saying, now there's an acronym I use called ACE, Awareness, Communication, and Education. That is, I mean, if you do those 3 things, you got to be, I mean, you got to go after it and you got to go hard, but it's really those 3 things that brings people into your space. If you're not bringing awareness to it, if you're not communicating and you're not educating your community, they're not going to know about any of the services or anything that you provide, regardless of, you know, their race or religion. They're just not going to know because you're not out there doing those things. So I would first start there and really looking at what is your sort of campaign around that. Sometimes your marketing communications team can help you with that.
And just let me add to just regarding that E that Keith spoke about education. I think a light way, another fun way would be to highlight different heritages. For instance, it's Hispanic Heritage Month right now. So feature one of your center members and have them teach a little bit about their Hispanic heritage. So you're learning through this process and you're seeing, and through learning, there's a lot of similarities in our cultures. So I think that's another way, a easy way maybe to introduce that, and then you can talk more about it and build conversation around it.
Great. Ken, we got you on.
So thank you. This is wonderful. I was going to kind of share a personal note with you. On my other life, I do work for a nonprofit of an orchestra of adults with disabilities here in Montgomery County. And we receive grant funding from the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County. And they have been really leaders in our organizations to really learn more about diversity and all the programming that you're talking about. And I have really found it that I've been able to, although we have a long way to go, I find that I am thinking a little differently now about things. And, you know, my whole perspective is I'm a Caucasian white male, and that's my perspective. And one of the things they were trying to teach us is that that's your perspective, and you need to look at things try to start looking at things from a different perspective. So it dawned on me earlier, it was like, it's kind of like cataracts. It's kind of let's try to take that fog off your windows a little bit and look at things from a different perspective and other people's perspective. And, you know, transferring that to Alfred House, my role here in dealing with families is I do feel like I am speaking differently towards different groups than I use. And I grew up in Northern New Jersey. I grew up in a very diverse upbringing in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And so I kind of thought I was pretty open-minded and didn't harbor any prejudices and fixed in certain ways. But you know what? I'm wrong. You know, we all do. And this program has helped me realize that and give me the opportunity to look at things from a different perspective, through different eyes. And I know for Alfred House, even in our activities, we have like a 5-page profile for residents. And it lists all different things and interests and things. And I know that the big part of that is diversity, cultural and things. So we have it on our radar, but we probably, like everybody else, I know our activities department tries to culturally mix things up, but we probably can still always do a better job. So I just kind of wanted to share that with you, that I have found it helpful personally. And we've only been to like one full day training and then some follow-up webinars on it. But it's really helped me, I think, become a better person. I'd like to think anyway.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Ken. And I echo a lot of your statements there. And also, I'm going to say to our panel, because you all are connected with various training programs, it would be great is that after this session, if you could send me any sort of organizations that you might recommend where our audience could get training, trade associations, what have you, that would be great. And let me get back to some of these questions that have come in because they're great. I'm gonna do, Keith, you alluded to this question from Nicole Rochester. She says, for Altonia and Keith, what do you feel are the 2 to 3 most effective ways to improve access to hospice care amongst patients of color?
Yeah, I'll go back and Tanya, you can, if you have something to add, like I said, it's the awareness, the communication, the education. And I actually came across that. I actually was going back home to Tallahassee, Florida, and I was attending a funeral. And there was a Black pastor that walked up to me and said, your mother tells me that you're working in hospice. I need you to come talk to my congregation because they're going to listen to people who look like us. And I found that very interesting. And then when I actually called the local hospice there, I went and met with them. They're not doing any awareness in that particular space. They're not really communicating to that group. They're not providing any education to that group. And I think once they actually started doing that, and I did speak to that congregation, but once they started, that local hospice started doing those things, they actually increased their number of African Americans being served within their community, because that's a very small knit area. Leon County is huge. I don't know if you guys are from Florida, but Leon County is a huge county, but not as diverse as you would think. And there's a lot of African Americans in that community that need those services, but they just were not really communicating with that area, just simply because they just wasn't doing it. Once they started doing it, they saw increases in that area.
And I don't mean to cut you off, Altonia, but I'm hoping that all three of you can kind of piggyback on this question with something that Keith was just talking about, is measuring success. And Julie Botroff says, as Keith stated, measuring success is critical. What specifically is being measured, and what initiatives have you all implemented to help you sort of gauge whether these efforts are making a difference? So I'm just throwing a bunch of questions into the mix here.
That's fine. And I just want to piggyback off what Keith said regarding to Nicole's question. Is education is key. It's awareness raising out externally, but going back inside again, looking at what we know and understand and have a foundational understanding anyway about various cultures. So understanding that it's different, recognizing, particularly amongst people of color, the systemic, racism and disparities that plague us to this day, mistrust of the healthcare system, acknowledging that and being aware of that. And so having that as your foundation and your basis, and then looking at how you approach things. If the particular community doesn't trust the system and now I'm dying and you're giving me free care, it's still, I might not trust that either. I sure won't, And so thinking about that and considering those things, and then looking at our approach and how we're discussing what we offer and meeting folks where they are, getting groups together and say, hey, this is what hospice is. How would you best receive this if I'm giving this message more broadly? Because maybe people don't want to hear, immediately about, you're going to die in 6 months or things of that nature, but we can focus maybe on the services we provide and then bring that around. But just taking time to understand the community, hearing from them how they want to be approached when it comes to this care, understanding certain cultures, customs around end of life care, the notion of a lot of minority and people of color communities, we care for our own. And I think Jennifer alluded to that with her parents not wanting to go to that place. So understanding all of those kind of cultural considerations as we approach various populations will be helpful. So awareness outside, internal, inside education and training. And just really quickly, I won't talk too much, but to measurement, some of the things we can measure is the increased utilization of services once we do the awareness as the utilization going up. Another area internally, looking at your workforce development, how is your recruitment efforts going? Are you being able to recruit more diverse staff based on your recruitment plan, or things of that nature are two areas you could measure. And I know Keith and Jennifer has more to add to that. So
Yeah, Jennifer, I'll let you go first before I answer the measurement question.
Sure. So for us, it is about, so on the staff side, we do an annual employee engagement survey, and it's making sure that there are diversity related questions as part of that. And so we started to integrate that because they weren't there before. So now we have a baseline, and then we can measure from year to year, does that shift, from every few months, does that shift? And are we seeing some movement? On the leadership side, I just facilitated the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is an assessment on intercultural competence. And so that's something that we're using for our leaders to measure also where are our leaders currently, and what will that look like a year from now with the work that now everybody's expected to do. Once again, that accountability piece. So those are just kind of two measurements that we're using, because you're right, how do we measure that success? If it is part of the strategic plan, believe me, it needs to be measured. And back to the idea of the goals and what are we doing this for? What are the goals organizationally? If these efforts are part of the strategic plan, they're going to happen. And so that's a really key piece of if we're talking about integrating this into the whole of an organization, that's the way to go, I believe.
Yeah. And to piggyback a little bit from a measurement perspective. So at Capital Caring, we're going to measure a lot, right? And it's really based on a framework. So if you guys remember me talking about our leadership and education and training and those other pillars where we all have measurement. So for instance, we're looking at very specific things within those groups. So for instance, leadership and governance, we're looking at our diversity actually on our governing board. We're looking at diversity within our leadership. We're looking at how do we educate our leadership and the percentage of those individuals that's been educated and been oriented to the center. For responsibility and accountability, how many of those have signed our core value statement that highlights our non-discrimination statements, things like that. So we are measuring a lot, and our goal is actually to develop a dashboard. So all of our tactics that we're doing, and we actually just went through this, those tactics that we're doing are actually going to bubble up to the strategic plan. And I'll follow up on education because I see there's another question to that. The importance of education to internal to our staff is a direct reflection of how we're going to benefit our community, right? So for instance, if you think of our NIJH accreditation at Capital Caring, we have educated our staff to those customs of that Jewish population as it pertains to end of life. So when they're walking into a person who is Jewish and they're walking into their homes, they know that there are certain things that they shouldn't do. They know there's certain things that they can do and that they can respect that. So it really, all of these efforts within equity, inclusion, diversity, before anything happens externally, you got to take a hard look internal at your organization, educate your organization, and get them up to par. Because what you don't want is your staff to go out into a field or go out into a space, not be fully educated, and then really stumble over themselves. And now you got to try all over again.
Yeah. And I know you sort of touched on the question that Rosalind Cooley-Prayer added there, which is, can you touch on the importance of educating both staff as well as participants? It's interesting. Our first discussion was a little bit different than this one. One of the elements that we talked about was how many times the staff feels very welcomed and honored in their organization by their other employees and by the management, but the participants, the residents or the members or the clients of the organization may have sort of a bias, racially or whatever. Every home care agency out there has probably received a phone call that said, my dad would like a caregiver, but the caregiver needs to be white. I've heard those stories, and we heard it on the last webinar. Any sort of thoughts on that topic? Is this sort of like, for lack of a better term, educating our clients, but then also letting our employees know that you may encounter some bias when you're out there at a client's home?
I will let the ladies go first before I answer that one.
Altonia, you want to go?
I can. So again, we talk about education and awareness a lot, internal, external. So from a client perspective, you know, just doing more, just education, outreach, sharing. They have our discrimination statements and things of that nature, and enforcing that and supporting our staff that way, and then understanding where they're coming from. Like Steve said, there are biases. We all have them. There's some that are implicit and unconscious, and then there are some that are just, you know, explicit. So understanding those and learning more about those from a patient perspective. I guess it goes back to community awareness and community engagement. And so when we're doing educating about our services, we talk a little bit about our diversity and inclusion, our diverse workforce, et cetera, and what that looks like. And we talk about the skills of those people and such. So that's a loose answer to that question. Jennifer and Keith have more to add.
Yeah. So there, we did a program called Ouch, That Stereotype Hurts with our staff members, because what we wanted to do was make sure that they felt empowered to say something, because what had been happening was we would hear these stories later on. Oh yeah, that's been happening for years. And we were like, what? Why wasn't that coming to human resources, or why wasn't that going up to the leader, to the management? And so when we were able to uncover these stories, we started kind of talking more with our staff members. And so this Ouch, That Stereotype Hurts training gives some language to when somebody says something, what do you say? Because I think at that point, the staff members like shocked, and there's a power differential there too. This is the person they're serving, they're supposed to be caring for. So how do you say something to them? So we're working on empowering our staff members. On the other side of that is we have some very vocal and helpful residents who are doing what they can to educate their fellow residents. And I think there's a lot of power in that, because versus me coming in and hosting a training on why you need to be more respectful and watch your language and all these things, that from their fellow residents, they're saying, hey, why did you say that? Well, and so there's this, so it becomes a conversation, and it's not perfect, it's a work in progress, but we're trying to create that culture where we're talking to each other. And if somebody says something that is disrespectful, racist, whatever, that we are having that conversation, that we're able to bring that out to the open and talk with that individual, do that follow-up. But once again, up front is setting the community standards and expectations of who we are and how we're going to be. But that doesn't always reach everyone. So there's, it's a process and journey, making sure that everybody is on the same page and helping as part of it.
No, that's great.
Yeah. And for me, I will tell you guys, like in working with our board and working with our executive leadership team, it really sort of falls on a couple of things. I've shared with my board and our executive leadership team that get comfortable being uncomfortable, because this has now been really put in our face, right? And it's going to make people uncomfortable, and we're going to have to make some uncomfortable decisions. We have an obligation with those who we contract with, those who are our strategic partners, to hold up non-discrimination at its highest level. We as an entity, as a company, and those that are working within that company, we hold those individuals to a high level of accountability if that's what we are doing. We don't want to partner with someone who doesn't follow a similar non-discrimination policy, right? We don't want to follow them. We don't want to contract with them because they are not embodying our spirit and our culture of what we're trying to display. So that's one. The other piece then is we have an obligation to protect our staff as well, right? So that's one from a client perspective and partnerships, but for an individual perspective, I've been in the organization 5.5 years, and I've overheard a couple of conversations that happened where there was a older white man who only wanted a white nurse. And is it disrespectful to our staff to send someone in of not what he requested? and we're at this business of service. So we have to have some balance there to make sure that we're also protecting our staff and also understanding that we now have a patient who really needs our care, and due to maybe the way they were brought up or their culture or just their time, they feel more comfortable in this space. And I think for us, we got to understand that balance of being uncomfortable while at the same time protecting our staff, because that is really important, especially with everything that's going on today. We got to hold that to the highest esteem.
Great, great. And on that topic, Ramsey Rahani just shared a comment. Very good issue raised about families requiring a white care provider. We notice about 50% of the times as a home care provider, we're able to change the family's mind and ask them to try a non-white care provider and see if the parent feels comfortable with the aid. The idea is to probe and not to take things for granted that the family will only consider a white care provider. Yes, some families are adamant, but about 50% of the times we're able to change their mind. But I think, thank you for sharing that, Ramsey. And I think what I heard Keith saying is we need to be very careful about putting our staff in a situation that may be uncomfortable, and we want to give the caregivers and our staff members the right to be able to share with us the true story of what's happening, and not
And keep in mind, and we're also in that, keep in mind, in all of our businesses and things that the organization is working, we're in a service as well. And all of our patients have choice. They have a choice of providers. And we can state, we can share with them our non-discrimination policy. We can share with them that we have a very diverse workforce, and we have a team of individuals who are providing you care. We can share all of that information. And yes, we can definitely make attempts to change one's mind. I think also from a staff perspective, you got to think about that staff member who's going to go in the home and already be on pins and needles, because they're going to be watching their every move. They're going to be judging everything that they do. And while we recognize that we hold our staff up and we've educated our staff, we also got to recognize that there is a human person. That staff member is a human who has feelings, and we don't want them tarnished by walking into a space like that that's going to be difficult for them, and then expect them to clear that and then go walk in another patient's home. So I think as much as we want to start shaping a lot of the attitudes and some of the biases that are out there, we do have an obligation as a service provider to provide those services, but most importantly, protect our staff.
Great, thank you. And I've got Jennifer Brown, who's got her hand raised, and then we got a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. And guys, I don't want to stop this conversation because it's so good. We usually wrap things up in an hour, but I appreciate our panel members sticking around and everybody in the audience sticking around for this important topic. Jennifer?
I guess I want to preface my remarks with the fact that being in senior housing for over 15 years, I've had these calls periodically about people moving in and wanting Caucasian caregivers. And I've been a commissioned salesperson for more than 50% of my career. I think as business people, there's a point where we have to say, I'm sorry, we can't provide that service to you. I'm not the owner of a home care agency. I don't have a franchise. But when do you say, I'm sorry, we are not able to honor that request? Because that sends a message to the client and to the buyer that that request is not a reasonable request. Reasonable isn't the right word. If you go into the ER, you go into a hospital, you have a surgical procedure, a diagnostic procedure. Do you turn to them and say, I don't want a black nurse conducting this procedure on me? I mean, you could.
I think I'm willing to bet people do.
How far do you think that's going to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. They do. I'm a nurse, by the way, too. And they do. they do say that. And I will say that kind of like what Keith said, it's important to, it's a fine line and balance and support. And there are times as a service provider, we are making our best effort to meet them where they are. However, managing expectations as well. I know there's times from a hospice perspective, we'll try to make accommodations as best we can. But realistically managing expectations, in the middle of the night at 2 a.m., I might not have a female nurse or, things of that nature. So managing those expectations, letting them know that, and again, giving them opportunity to understand that maybe we're not the best provider for you. If that's your need, you want great quality care from skilled trained clinicians, we have all of that. But if there's a preference that we just can't meet, we let them know upfront, honest, manage expectations, and then give them an option. The best advice I can give in that.
Yeah, no, and I agree, Tanya. That the expectation is key. You have a patient that's coming onto your service who's making requests like that. You definitely got to set expectations. We can try to accommodate, but at the end of the day, they have choice. We share we share with them what we are able to provide, things that we cannot guarantee. And to Tanya's point, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you may not have what you want, but this is a highly skilled individual who's coming in your home to take care of you. And so at that point, you have choice. You can stay with us or you can go with another provider. But I think you just have to lay those things out in the very beginning.
Great. And then I'm going to do one last question here that's typed in. It's how do you encourage staff involvement in a diversity program when they feel their honesty may have a negative impact on their employment? And I think the two organizations that we're featuring here are just model examples of where there's a full-on commitment to have open dialogue and share, but you can see where in some organizations where, hey, I'm going to be very guarded in what I reveal and what I share. And in fact, I remember one of our panel members on the first panel, Arvette Reed, I believe she was talking about as an African-American employee going up through the ranks where she always felt like she had to be to work early, like she took extra precautions so that she would not be penalized, and the world has changed through her career, thankfully, but honesty, I think addressing that as employees, if you've got any thoughts.
So I would say for me, and I've shared this with Tanya before, again, we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We respect all comments as long as they are thoughtful. They're coming from a space of being humble. You got to respect people's comments. Everyone has had a different path to where they are in their life, and they have experienced different things, and some of those things are very raw. And actually, Tanya actually mentioned our visual that we had, and we actually had an opportunity for staff members to share their stories, which are really, really powerful, and no one shamed them or said anything negative about their comments, because again, these things are powerful. These are things that individual employees have went through. You really want to, and I shared this with Tanya when we first started this, is that we want ambassadors who want to do this work. If they just come in and say, oh, it sounds like it's something nice to do, that's not what we want. We want people who are passionate around this topic. And some people you may have to go and poke to see if they are the right person, but we open it up to our staff members to apply. And they went through an application process, and we reviewed those applications, and then we selected the appropriate staff members for 18-month terms. So like we went through that piece, and then we don't hold any of their comments against them. We just make sure that they know sort of the rules stepping in. Like, you can share your comments, just be respectful.
And I like to piggyback. I think what's really important here is at the highest level, if that's your organizational, not strategy, but your mission is to have this inclusive, welcoming environment of belonging, that if it's at that level and people do want to speak out about things or mistreatment or things that are happening to them or complaints they may have because they've been treated a certain way internally, or policy seems, unfair, things like that. If it's approved and your CEO and your leadership supports that, it should be a platform for an environment to welcome that, where there's no retaliation, and things of that nature. That's part of Keith's role, is actually, if there's complaints on that level, he investigates those, he takes them seriously. And one of the biggest things too is when people tell you their experiences, no matter how outlandish they may seem to you, or that's never been my experience, trust them. That's their experience. So that's very important. Take their experience for what they say it is. And then if your leadership, of course, if they're bought into this, inclusive environment, they will support that and not allow for retaliation. And those who tend to do that will be reprimanded appropriately. So that's another, it sounds very maybe harsh and strict, but it's really important if you want to shift the culture and make a change and show the commitment of the organization.
Right.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it really is, it's that cultural shift. If there is the sentiment that, gosh, I can't speak up, then that really, it's a shift that needs to take place where you have to show that we listen and we do something, we act on things. So if there is some engagement survey of some sort, some question, an opportunity for folks to share their experiences, is there follow-up? Are they saying things and are they being heard, right? So they can say something, and whether it's retaliation or just not even responding, employees pay attention to that. So how, as organizations from the top down, are we truly listening to what the issues are, and not just listening, but acting upon it? And employees, they pay attention. So what does that action look like? What's the follow-up look like? What's the conversation look like beyond that?
Great. Well, this has been a great discussion. I'm going to close with a friend of mine who she just posted in the questions, Val Walker. She's a hospice volunteer and an end-of-life doula. I need to have her come on board and talk about that profession. But she says, I definitely have to fill gaps of care for African-American patients at end of life. Hats off to the panelists. Great education discussion. And I echo Val's comments. This has been a real engaging dialogue. I appreciate you guys sharing so much and what you're doing in your organizations, and all the attendees for hanging on for a little bit of a longer but interesting program. And we recorded this, so we'll share the recording with everybody. Panel members, shoot me some links that we can share with the audience to help them with their programs, and we'll follow up with you all. And I can assure you this isn't going to be the last time we talk about this topic. I really look forward to the next time we dive into it deeper. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
You bet. I'm just gonna save the chat here real quick. Okay, excellent. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.